Good evening. My name is Sandy Waters, and I am the president of the League of Women Voters of Greenwich. The League is a 501c3 nonpartisan grassroots educational and advocacy organization dedicated to empowering everyone to participate fully in our democracy. We never support any candidate for public office. The advocacy function of the League nationally, statewide, and locally relies upon a study of specific governmental issues and membership discussion and support to adopt an advocacy position. Beginning in 2019, League members in Greenwich identified the capital process decision-making process as an important local issue and approved the creation of a capital project study committee to provide the Greenwich community with transparency on how capital projects are selected, prioritized, calendared, and funded. It is this study that we are here to talk about tonight. The work began in earnest in June 2021 with the selection of new committee chairmen. They are Steve Waters, who is a prior or current board chair and a member of either the finance or audit committees of 3 public, 10 private companies, and 4 nonprofits. He was co-CEO of Morgan Stanley International and is a current chair of Compass Partners Capital. Waters has been a town resident since 1976 and is a League member and an unaffiliated voter. Barbara O'Neill is the co-chair. She's a former teacher and administrator in the Greenwich Public Schools, and following retirement, she served 8 years as a Republican member of the Board of Education, 2 as chair. Currently, she's in her 2nd term on the RTM, representing District 6 on the Education Committee. Barbara is a 43-year Greenwich resident and a League member. The Capital Project Study Committee presented its final report to the League membership on January 11th, 2023, responded to questions, and then developed a concurrent statement, which was unanimously approved by the membership on January 25th of 2023. Thus, the current statement reflects an advocacy position of the 345 members of the League of Women Voters of Greenwich. This presentation is related to the advocacy and educational functions of the League of Women Voters of Greenwich and is an opportunity for the public to learn about the report of its Capital Project Study Committee. We encourage all residents to read these documents and to engage in community dialogue with us about how we can better address the town's capital needs. The links to the report and the concurrent statement are in the chat, and both documents are available on the homepage of our website. Tonight's Zoom webinar session will include a presentation from committee members and a Q&A session. Attendees may communicate and submit questions with co-hosts through the Q&A function. We're not using the chat and reactions functions in this webinar. Many Zoom attendees submitted questions in advance upon registration. They may also submit questions through the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. The questions will be directed to committee members by 2 League board members, Abigail McCarthy and Christina Broderick. Jess Reed from Greenwich Point Marketing is helping us manage the technical aspect of the Zoom, including the posting of our PowerPoint. The Zoom will be recorded and posted on our website and distributed afterwards. We're all coming from all different locations all over the place. We're in Maine, and some are in New Hampshire, and some are in Greenwich. So I appreciate your willingness to attend tonight. But at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Steve for his presentation.
Good, thank you. Joining me tonight are 2 members of the 11-person committee. John Weiner. John's just come onto the screen. John, do you want to just tell people a little bit about your background? And then Kate, I'll ask you to do the same.
Thank you, Steve. I'm the partner and the chief investment officer of Rethink Healthcare Properties. We are a private equity firm that invests, as the name would indicate, in medical real estate around the country. I've been doing this quite some time. Prior to this, I was a partner at Ernst & Young And early in my career, I was a municipal investment banker with some of the major Wall Street firms.
Great. And Kate, you want to come next?
Sure. Thank you, Steve. I am a registered architect with a background in construction, specifically school construction for about the last decade, but starting at Robert Stern Architects in New York City, and then continuing a career at Perkins Eastman Architects in Stamford, Connecticut. I am also served on a number of boards, including the Architectural Review Board here in Greenwich, as well as the RTM for a number of years.
Great, thank you. Kate and John are two of our 11-person committee. We chose that committee rather unusually because we wanted to have a balance of perspectives on it. People who were Republican, people who were Democrat, people who were women, people who were men, older and younger perspectives. The common thread, though, that we said when we recruited the committee was you need to be willing to work hard, and if you don't want to, that's okay. Just don't join the committee, and listen to each other. And we consciously said we're not sure when we started of what the questions are. So if you already know all the questions and all the answers, you probably shouldn't be on this committee either. And that was a hallmark as we went through it. And so that, in a sense, set the tone for what we were trying to do. We were trying to come up with, to see if there were observations on which we could agree that made common sense and could be done to improve the way the town government operates. But again, we didn't know that initially the questions, and we didn't know, let alone the answers. I am happy to say that the points that end up here are a consensus, i.e. there was unanimity among the diverse members of the committee. And we really view this as the beginning, not the end of a dialogue about things that the town could do better. So that was how we framed it. We then did a series of interviews, and we got great cooperation from all sorts of people in the town, both in the political parties, in the town departments, in the Board of Ed, and we used a lot of outside experts as well in municipal finance, the town's advisors and others. We talked to other AAA rated towns to their senior people as to what they were doing, because we wanted to help us create a framework. We came to the conclusion that the town's wish list for capital is very large, i.e. An ungraded wish list is probably in excess of $2 billion for capital projects. Part of those are schools. A lot of them are not in schools. And we came to a conclusion as well that with a list that large, that it was very difficult to compare projects across areas. We also ended up coming to a conclusion that while that list was quite large, that our real limitation was not availability of capital to deal with these projects, but rather practices and procedures and policies. And so we will talk about those. As far as we were concerned as a committee, you will see Kate and John and me interact. That's the way the committee worked. We didn't always agree with each other, but we kind of talked stuff through. And we recognized that this, again, we did not intentionally try to propose something very radical. We, for example, discussed, should we have charter change? And we felt that maybe we should have charter change if we can't get the system to work other ways. But we felt that there were ways to work within the system and to improve the system. And I can say that I'm sure we should expect it, but so far we have not had negative pushback from the parties whom we've briefed following the publication of this or the approval of the study in January. It doesn't mean nothing in here should be taken as gospel, but rather as a basis for people of various persuasions to try to agree. And we will, as Sandy said, allow you to have questions, but I think what we'd like to do is go through the points, kind of the key points one by one, and Kate and John and I will alternate doing that. So Kate, I think maybe I'll turn it over to you and let you go to talk about kind of the initial point.
Sure. And I think, do we have a slide that we were going to put up with this, or I can
Yeah,
talk to it?
I think we should. Okay, if we go, let's move on that. Go on to the next one. Okay, we've talked about that. Room to improve.
Here we are.
There you go. There you go, Kate.
All right, we've arrived. So one of the first key observations that we found ourselves kind of finding this consensus on was strategic vision and the need for it. The town needs to identify these critical elements of what it wants to look like in 20 years from now. What we had either experienced from our own time in government or working with was that Greenwich has a very decentralized system. It has overlapping powers and was lacking a formal strategic vision. At first, we gravitated towards something like the Plan of Conservation and Development. And we asked, well, is this something that's already been done? We've heard of, we've had lots of studies over time. Is this a study that we can use? And we landed on that that's a planning document for land use. And it didn't actually function as a overarching organization for all town departments. As Steve kind of mentioned in his intro, the work that we have to do, the work that's in the vision, is really on a lot of numbers of scale. So we have projects that maybe have large impact, but are small scale or small dollar amount. And we have the reverse of that. We have large impact projects, but that also have very large budgets or may have long timelines. So the issue was that with this decentralized system, it was very hard to shifting priorities and sometimes conflicting priorities between different user groups. And from there, we started with a recommendation that the first selectman should really work with town leadership to create strategies and a financial plan to accomplish shared elements of the vision. And that was something that when we looked at things like the POCD, we found that financial plan, tying our vision to a way to get there, was the kind of the next key observation that we felt we needed. And so I'm going to pass off to John to start talking about that bullet. And Steve,
let me maybe interject very briefly. We felt that it needed to go beyond, it's way beyond a one-year budget cycle, or even some of the current 5-year financing guidelines that you all know about. And that we needed to have a group. It doesn't mean that the first selectman has to do it, but we thought this first selectman was the logical person to start this initiative and could draw in people from the community as he did, or he or she could. And we thought that the horizon needed to be longer than 5 years, because 5 years, as you know, is been very comfortable historically, people thought, for funding. But a lot of the town's needs aren't within 5 years. You're talking about a situation where we may have to look at beachfront and shore protection, as well as schools and a variety of new buildings. So this is way more about just schools. And that was the approach that the committee took. So I think the committee did not create this report as we need to build education as our only focus. The other point that I would add is that virtually all of the participants with whom we talked agreed we did this, i.e. they said, you can do year-to-year stuff, but if you don't have a plan, where are you going? You don't know where you're going. And so that's why we started with that. So John, do you want to talk about a financial plan that might fit into this kind of a vision?
Sure. So, I would, first of all, just acknowledge that the vision is probably one of the most difficult parts of this. And so I think you can't have a financial plan, true with anything, in business or in your personal life. You can't really have a financial plan, as Kate and Steve said, unless you know where you're going. But if we can get to that point, when we get to that point where we have a strategic vision of where the town is heading and how we get there, then what we want to do is develop a financial plan around it. And the vision, again, to Steve's point, is, well, how do you do that? Where does it originate? And we thought really it should start with the first selectman, and the person serving in that role should bring in the necessary people that he thinks would be helpful. Important, we thought, was people who are not in the political process, who are unaffiliated, who are experts in certain areas. So we get a good sort of representative base of people who live in town. And we make sure that we have the experience, the expertise needed to kind of work through the financial plan that fits the strategic vision. To date, the town has had a 15-year capital improvement plan. The issue with that plan has often been that it's relatively usable in the near term, almost unusable in the long term. So you can spend a lot of time thinking about what's happening between year and 10 and 15, and rarely are those the things that actually happen out in that period. So the focus really needs to be in a shorter term period where you can really hone in on, what are the projects we can identify in a relatively manageable period of time, say 5 to 10 years. And then, of course, how do you fund those? And I would also, I would mention that there's really, when you talk about capital, there's two things. Kate mentioned it earlier. There's sort of your new projects that crop up larger in scale. And then there's just kind of the regular capital needs of existing, existing buildings, of infrastructure in town. So the latter actually can be pretty well programmed out in terms of any, for instance, owner of commercial real estate would be typically running a 10-year capital plan for their real estate. And the town can do the same thing. You can look at your existing assets and say, we know when a roof will need to be replaced. We know when elevators need to be replaced. The pointing on a brick building, so all these things can be laid out pretty reliably. And then you get into some of the, larger initiatives. Steve mentioned schools as an example, but, the waterfront is very important to this town, performing arts. So many of the things that we all use and enjoy in the town kind of fall into that category. Those, well, they have some flexibility. They don't have unlimited flexibility. And so part of the vision then relates to the capital plan or the financial plan, which is, when do you plan to do those and how will you actually fund those?
And I think it's probably worth adding that it will change, but it ought to be a blueprint that ultimately helps the relevant bodies focus on things that are done. And I'll give you a good example. The BET a number of years ago, 2017, 18, did a priority study on a variety of mostly school-related construction stuff. That was 6 years ago, and there's not a shovel in the ground on any of those projects. And that's not meant to say people don't have good intentions, but we need to have something that allows the town to adapt over time and plan in advance. And involved in this project is agreeing on what some of the parameters are. For example, we're a AAA credit. We Greenwich are a AAA credit. There are 16 towns in Greenwich that have that. And we will talk about policies later, but we have a lot of things we can do and still maintain that kind of a AAA rating, which gives you the greatest chance of availability of funds at an acceptable cost. So there may be some limitations. There might be a practical debt limits that we have. The town is under what its practical debt limit probably can be. But that ought to be a conscious part of the discussion. And then, as John said, in that, identifying all of the tools we have. There, of course, are taxes or capital levies. There is borrowing. There are private and public funds. There are state and federal dollars. There are fees. There are lots of things. And we had some folks on our committee who kind of do financial plans for a living. There was a sense of the committee that this could be done. It would not be a Herculean task to create it. That the harder task was actually to say, what do we want to think about funding over a certain time horizon, but that a financial plan could be done. And we thought this made a sense, particularly at a time where we've had inflation, because as all of you know, prices have been going up dramatically in the period as the country and Greenwich have come out of the COVID lockdown. And it becomes increasingly expensive to fund things in the future when there's high inflation. So we think all of those are relevant parts of a financial plan to fit the strategy, but that you really couldn't, as John said, create the plan without the strategy. John, did you want to maybe talk about a financial model as well?
You know, I do, Steve. And one other point I would make about all of this is that, you know, there does need, I mean, part of creating this financial plan is an actual way to look at capital projects and decide, you know, which capital projects, how they rank overall. And I think in a town like Greenwich, and most towns, honestly, there's a huge wish list of projects. And obviously they can't all be done. So one of the, you know, I think as we looked at you know, how this happens as part of this study, we thought about, you know, creating the need to create consistent investment criteria so that each, you know, each effectively capital item was analyzed in the same way, the request was prepared in the same way, and ultimately they could be ranked, because only in a way that, you know, everybody has their own priorities. You know, each department has their own priority from a political perspective. You know, you may have your own priorities for your constituency. You know, all that said, there does need to be a common ranking method. And once that's done, you can tweak it around the edges, but at least it gives you a way to start. And that, you know, would be a joint effort, probably starting out with the town departments, but then, you know, moving on to the first selectman, the BET, the RTM. So all the bodies that effectively would evaluate the capital projects in Greenwich.
Well, and the reason we went to this, and maybe you should, can you switch the screen to an agreed financial model? That's the next plan, the next screen item. There we go. We thought this because right now we sometimes have dueling models with different inflation assumptions, different lives of projects, more or less complete information. And so, and there is not an effectively enforced requirement now that we need all of a certain kind of information before we can evaluate something. And it looked like kind of low-hanging fruit. And whether that is housed at the BET or the RTM or the town finance department, people can talk about, but it ought to be transparent and people ought to be arguing about the same thing as opposed to what probably more often than it need to be are people arguing using very different assumptions about what's going to go on. And doing this would allow both full and accurate analysis of projects, but then, as John said, allow us to compare projects across departments. And we just thought from the standpoint of having the town decide this one's more important than that, the more common the data and the database was, the better off we were. So that's how we came out about that. And Kate, maybe do you want to talk about this question of prioritization? Because John touched on it, but we gave that a lot of thought.
Yes, and also I did want to say how we talked about how the financial model, it ties back to that strategic vision, and we'll get to this part a little bit later, but how the, project demand, because in construction, of course, there are construction timelines. And so a financial model and a financial plan is going to help us to work with that strategic vision. And it's actually going to help us enhance the process for setting our priorities if we can understand the timelines on those priorities and the financial demands on those priorities. But when we dug into setting priorities, because
let's move on to the next slide.
Yeah, we're going to have to go to the next slide. Yep. So we know that there is I'll call it, a cut sheet. There's kind of a document that, there's a couple of boxes that are checked off and a very small summary, and it's kind of handed in, or it is handed in. But our recommendation was to create a more standardized form for proposing these projects that includes scope, that includes cost, that includes return on investment. That's going to help prioritize and allow the officials, whether it's the selectmen or the BET or the RTM, to be looking at that apples to apples data-driven decision making. And they're going to do that with actual, with data before them, so that they can compare the cost to an infrastructure to the cost of the school to a cost of something that maybe has an amenity value, like well, let's touch on the skating rink, and or a civic center, because there's intrinsic value to each one of these, and different groups or are going to have different types of investment across it. We felt that by putting in things that include scope, cost, and that return on investment, it really helps drive a decision-making process that comes from a standard set of criteria, and it will streamline the process moving forward.
We went around this a lot because, as all of you know, probably because you know a lot about town government, currently the deciding vote belongs to the chairman or chairwoman of the BET. As you know, it's 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans. The party that gets the most most votes for BET in the prior election picks the chairperson. And in a situation where the parties are not working well together, that means that the ultimate decision-making belongs to one party, and as stated by the chairperson who has that tie-breaking vote. We would hope that the parties, in fact, can do a good job working together, and frankly, probably a better job than they have recently. But that, again, we don't control that. But right now, effectively, the most important person in this town priority setting is the chairperson of the BET, with consultation with the first select person. That may be the way it can work best, but if it can't, we have an issue. And the reason is kind of embedded in some of our practices. For example, the RTM can reduce but can't increase projects, so that if, for example, the RTM didn't agree with a decision by the chairperson of the BET, it can't raise that amount. So we thought that there, but we also thought there should be broader talk about practices and priorities. In our view, having 2 meetings only subject to public input is too few. And in addition, candidly, there have been situations in the past where basically decisions were made in December, and then we went through 4 months of meetings and came out with exactly the same decision in May. And I think that we just thought that was not very constructive, because the public ought to be more involved. And we understand that it can be a pain if you're a committee chairperson or on a committee to do that. But we thought the current system was really not the best we could do. And if for some reason we stayed away from the issue of charter change, we could have said the recommendation it would be to change the charter. And we said, look, we would rather see the parties on the BET work better together and be more and involve other folks. And so we thought it ought to be transparent. And we were talking earlier about the need for using all of our funding tools. It's great to have civically minded individuals willing to give money to a project and get something started. But one thing that has to be done carefully is not let the availability of a large private donation skew the priorities and kick other things out that would otherwise be done that were actually higher priority. And that's why being more transparent about our priorities was something we thought would help the decision making in the town. We also let's move on to number 5, if we could, which goes into this point of public awareness. We thought that it was better to get public input along the way and early, and that we could collectively do a better job of getting that, as opposed to waiting for crises to stimulate what we did. We've all read about the North Miami school, the crumbling walls at Central, sewage in the old Greenwich basement. Those are all unfortunate. They're probably in many cases a function of lack of maintenance in the past. That's our own fault, a self-inflicted wound. But there are projects, public awareness. We shouldn't be relying on crises to tell us what has to be funded and what our projects ought to be. Right now, we kind of feel like as if we're playing catch up. There's some simple things that could be done. For example, some of our town bodies don't allow attendance, video attendance. You only can come to an actual in-person meeting. Is that the best way to go? We're not sure. We were not sure. But if you've completed, have standardized way to compare projects and information in advance, then you should have your discussion on the substance, not on presentations. A number of us, and I know a number of the listeners probably say it is the worst thing for me is to go to a meeting where people are not talking about substance, but purely either presenting stuff that we should have had in advance, and are really not dealing with the central issues. And we thought greater public awareness, which we know can be a pain in the rear end for people who are in charge of a committee, could actually help us. So that was one. We just thought we could do better without a lot of damage. Kate, do you want to talk further about how we oversee projects?
Yes, absolutely.
That'll be the next slide.
Great. So project oversight. Ongoing oversight and evaluation. When have we done it well? How do we want to repeat that? Let's celebrate successes and not just fall into this mode of reaction to crises. And some of that project oversight we started to discuss was that it's uneven and sometimes at times missing. School construction, when it goes through state of Connecticut reimbursements, is a relatively heavily regulated process. However, we build lots of different things in town, and they could be under all different kinds of, regulation. It could be federal government regulation or Department of Environmental Protection regulations. So we thought, that all large projects really should start to engage some type of owner's project manager and professional cost estimating, and not doing that just once, but doing it at regular intervals throughout the project. You could have a projected project cost when you start the project. Then you can do a check-in when you have something more paper to pencil to paper. And that we track not only that, but we also track what projects are receiving reimbursements, and those reimbursements could come from a number of sources. I already mentioned the state of Connecticut, but there's also energy reimbursements. We have the federal ARP and ESSER funds. So there are reimbursements coming from, different areas, and making sure that those reimbursements are actually captured on a project, recorded on a project, and that we have the accounting available so that when, auditing comes into play, those reimbursements, stand the test, that everything was tracked and transparent and available, to make sure that, these projects could be financially successful, as well as great projects that are going to last our community for a lifetime. We also wanted a lot of that documentation to have a sense of public transparency, that you could attend meetings and have the opportunity to have those documents available in a form that was readily accessible to the general public. We really thought that was a strong recommendation. And again, it comes to kind of back to that advocacy that Steve was talking about, all hands on deck crisis situation, when we have a school that's closed or condemned, is, not the place where we want everybody to all of a sudden try and scramble and figure out how they can become engaged and how they didn't know about that. We want to have that information upfront and throughout the project.
Kate, if I could just make a quick point too, only that, we are embarking on a period of time where Greenwich will be undertaking larger projects, projects of a size that they don't do on a regular basis with the schools. So what you're saying becomes even more important, because the technical capability to manage these projects, obviously the complexity goes up with the type of project you're working on. And I think to many of your points, it becomes even more important now than ever.
Absolutely. And it's not just the oversight, but we wanted to tie it to accountability as well. And that's why we discussed things like the owner's representative and professional cost estimating, as well as building committees that have departmental staff as well as community volunteers. Some of the departmental staff might have certain skill sets that trend towards the needs of particular projects.
We also think the town has not done, in our opinion, a good job at looking back and saying what worked on one project, what are the lessons we can learn. And when we're in a period where we're doing, we have a large list of potential projects, being able to compare and learn things, it really will help us a lot. We don't think it has to be just with a building committee or just with an owner's rep or just with the town. We think there are different people who can be involved. We know it's hard to staff building committees. So a minimum size threshold should be decided for big projects that need that kind of supervision. But we did not agree with the assertion which some have made, the town can only do one project at a time. We think if we are in that mode, we will not make the dent in the town's capital backlog that we need to. So using all of the potential for oversight is something we will want to do. And again, we thought this was pretty much low-hanging fruit. The next thing we looked at, and this was not something we thought we would come into to start, but it was just how long our budget cycle takes. We think it can be shortened. We talked to other AAA towns who did in 4 or 5 months what we do in 9, and did not have the repetitive meetings or duplicative meetings, I guess I should say, where the same questions are asked again. We thought that would, I'm sure this is a controversial recommendation because it means that some of our town bodies would have to cooperate with each other or have combined hearings or allow a different kind of attendance. But we thought there was a lot of opportunity to use people's time better and get good results. We understand that it's a function of our decentralized system, and that by saying this, someone will feel that their ox is being gored. But we just think we can do a lot better without a lot of work. And again, the other towns with whom we talked with their town manager or their town finance chiefs. They just did things differently from how we do it. They did converse with each other and have more dialogue than we sometimes have in our town. But we thought this was something that could be dealt with.
Steve, there was
yeah.
in the practical side of all of this too is the process wasn't done almost until midsummer, and as a result, projects had to wait in order to know if they were getting funding. And so some of the folks that we talked to indicated that that was problematic because by the time they knew they had the funding, many of the contractors they had to do business with had already accepted jobs. So there was a practical aspect. And then if you get to the schools, they need to do a lot of their work in the summer. So pushing the final answer into midsummer, into June, did become, just from a practical basis, problematic. If we could make these decisions 2 months earlier, a month or two earlier, it would really just benefit the process of how you go about, once you know you have your funding, contracting for services and then performing them.
Great, John. Thank you. Well, why don't you and I tag team this last point, which is the full use that we've alluded to this before, the full use of the town's financial capabilities. We know, I'm not as much long-term a resident of Greenwich as many, I'm sure, who are on the call are. I have lived here for 47 years. I have seen pay-as-you-go and modified pay-as-you-go and pay things off in 5 years. And I would simply say, as we've looked, and I understand that Greenwich went bankrupt during the Depression, which is 90 years ago. The committee is not saying, let's just open the taps and spend. We're saying anything but that. But we believe that the town can do if the town looks at its financial tools and its policies, that it can fund faster than we have been over the last not really long number of years. Our policies are among the more restrictive in Connecticut. Our tax rate is either the lowest or the second lowest in the state, and yet we are a AAA, and we have unused debt capacity, which we could take advantage of if we chose to. And that's a decision. It's not a practical limit. We know that what's going on before has kept tax rates low on a year-to-year basis. But what they're doing that and deciding not to fund things or sending things back for additional work is what has created this more than $2 billion backlog of things to do. I have no brief one way or another for what happens with Central Middle School, but I will tell you that after years of bad maintenance, I had a son who went to Central Middle School in 1990, at which point it was seriously in need of major work, and yet we just kicked the can down the road. And that's not to blame anybody, because lots of people were involved in that decision. But underfunding of maintenance means the chickens come home to roost at some point. We concluded as a committee, and we had some very conservative financial committee members who ended up agreeing with all of these recommendations. We thought that it was really our policies and our practices, not availability of money, that was a limit to us. Part of that relates to what debt maturity we are or are not willing to use. We, the town, have access to longer term money, and that ought to be that the nature of what we look at. We ought to look at all of our tools. I think it's fair to say, and I saw some of the earlier questions, we did miss a low interest rate environment that happened in the 2021 period. Doesn't mean one won't come again, but I think if we ought to look, can we fund and take advantage of that? I've heard members of the RTM say, well, I will never be a market timer. But I was on the board of a public company when I was just getting started on this study. The CFO had said, I was on the finance committee. He came to the finance committee and the board and said, interest rates are the lowest they've been for 20 years. We should issue debt. And I can remember talking to various town officials who kind of looked at me and laughed because they said, well, we would never be a market timer. I think that's an absolute that we don't need to have. We need to look at how carefully we balance our tools. We've talked about all of the different pieces, the tax level, the use of our reserve fund, various sorts of borrowing, federal and state money, private money. Those ought to all be put together. And we believe that this can be done prudently without busting the bank or putting the town into moral hazard or some of the kind of buzzwords that we have heard. But the committee believes that it is possible to accelerate what we are doing in a prudent way. John, what would you add to that? Because you were part of that group that focused on funding options and policy.
Well, it's clear, Steve, that, as we delved into it and talked to our bond advisor and looked at, what's happened in the recent past, we have the capacity to do what needs to be done. And a lot of it without any tax increases, but there might have to be some modest, very modest increases in order to fund a bulge of these larger school construction projects. Unfortunately, I think that without the vision, going back to where we started on this, and without the driving force of the vision, then it gives the ability to kind of push things off. And so what's happened here, I think there's a recognition that things need to be done, but the will has been, I think from a will standpoint, it gets pushed down the road. So if we had, I think, more a vision that was leading us, I think we have the financial capability to do this as a town. In that sense, we're very fortunate. And I think it would have served us well to get started before this, but even now is a great environment. And, we need to push forward on the projects that need to be done.
I also wanted to, sorry,
Kate, please, but
I just wanted to add one thing about the vision too, is that I don't think that any of us thought that the vision was something that should bring work to a halt, work that was already in progress. So this isn't a time to say, oh, let's pause everything we're doing, put pencils down. The vision is something that has to be integrated into what we already have. Many of us, we weren't looking at restructure. We were looking at improvements on what we already have, not completely disassembling a system and a structure that many of us had already worked in through a number of different positions, whether it was Board of Ed or RTM or BET or as a resident citizen.
And so I think that, thank you, Kate, that important to add. We thought in summary that these were things that could be done by people that weren't a Democrat or a Republican issue. They were issues on which the committee, which was we probably had more Republicans than any other group on our committee. And so we thought that these were things that people who said, what can we do in the town that might be better, make life better for us, could be done, and through conversation and work through on an issue by issue basis. We understand that there will be entities in town and bodies and people in town who might say, gee, that particular thing is, you need to rethink that and change that or change this. That's okay. We did not attempt to come up with the answer. We did not try to prioritize public works expenditures over school expenditures. We did not try to prioritize within the school. Other people can do that. We just thought our process was doing it could be improved. We did think that the demand for various capital items was large enough now that we needed to look for ways to accelerate things, because the way we've done things over quite a bit of time while I've been in Greenwich is what really brought us to this sense of urgency of capital needs. And so we think this is in the town's interest. We think it can be done without breaking the bank at all. And we have stayed away. These are things that people who are willing to talk and work together can get to without having to go to something that's more dramatic like charter change. And I guess with that, that's the summary of what we had said. And I think then a couple of the league board members are going to open us up for questions.
All right. Thanks for your presentation. I know that the devil is in the details, and there are a lot of questions already have been put forward. The way it's going to work now is that we will have Abigail McCarthy and Christina Broderick, who are both league board members. We'll do a tag team with each other and pose the questions to you, and hopefully you will answer them to everyone's satisfaction.
Yeah, and I'm sure there'll be some that we can't.
That's possible too, right? Okay, Abigail and Christina, are you on?
Yes,
Okay, good. Go for it.
thanks everyone. Okay, so the first question we have for the committee is, why is the league undertaking this study and not our elected officials?
I can't speak to why our electoral officials have not done anything they've done. I can tell you that the league has tried to be unbiased and kind of call it the way we see it. We tried to do that with this study. We did not have a political agenda and really tried to work it that way. And we tried to be, the league's job is to educate, it tries to educate the public and look for opportunities to improve the town. And so I think it's from my perspective, it was totally logical that the league did this. And the league has done these sorts of studies before. The one thing that I did emphasize when I was asked to recruit a committee and then help do this was you shouldn't do a study just to do it. Everybody's too busy to do a study just because you want to do a study. So let's focus this on things that we as a town could do if people can work together.
I do think, Steve, that much of what's in the report represents best practices. So we're not necessarily recreating the wheel here, but every organization in the town as an organization, if you will, has its own culture and creates a way of doing things. So I think it's a good to have an objective body like the league come out and say, let's just think about different ways we could do it that might improve a process is important for the community.
I just wanted to add too that, November comes every year, and the league's purview is, it really encapsulates, educating our community, educating voters. And there may come a time that, maybe an elected official, you find yourself in a discussion with them, in passing, or maybe you find them at their door and they say, what do you want? And what can I do for you? I'm here and I'm interested in hearing what's important to you. And so, this document with its best practices, I think serves as a tool for our community, to take it or leave it, but to consider it. And if that question is asked to them, they can, have a real conversation about some things that are important to them and how they want to get there.
Great. We have a question about, this person says, I worry that doing a strategic plan will only lead to further delays, as it has in the past. For example, the 2017 capital study by the BET. Those that don't want to move forward because you could use it as an excuse to kick the can down the road. What are your views on this?
We are not saying stop everything and do nothing until you have a strategic discussion or vision. So we think these things can be done simultaneously. We would hope that whoever the elected select person is in November says, I will help get this process started, because this is a longer term effort. I mean, if you believe that the world is getting warmer and that our coasts are going to be a protection of the environment, and the coasts is going to become more of an issue, you ought to start to factor that into overall planning. So if we don't do things like that, we won't get there. But in fact, many of the things we're talking about in these recommendations could be done candidly, I think, within a period of months, if people were able and willing to work together.
And I don't think it's something that is done and put on the shelf, right? So a lot of things in the recommendations talked about continual check-ins, coming back to the public, revisiting, continuing to effectively do better, right? And let's continue to build on a strong foundation. Understanding, just like Steve said, things may come up that require a pivot. Maybe something that wasn't a priority has to become a priority out of necessity, or new information comes to light, or new data that requires a pivot in a direction. But if we don't have that foundation, we won't even know when we're changing course.
I would just add to that also that, we're all, I think as a town, we can all be very proud of the fact that we have a AAA bond rating. But a lot goes into receiving a AAA rating, and the finances of a town are only one of any number of important criteria. So if you ultimately don't start to, address some of the things, for instance, risk from climate change, as an example, or your school system or other major infrastructure projects in town, that can also have an effect on your bond rating too. So what we're really, I think, running the town, it's a mission of balance of, you want to spend properly, but you also want to make sure that we're preparing for the future in the way that our rating will continue to reflect, the highest quality as it does right now.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Are you suggesting that the first select person get substantially increased power?
No. We're suggesting that the first select person should lead. We have not recommended transferring authority for final authority for spending to the first select person. But we do think that to do this, that the first select person should be on board and ideally will help lead this project.
Any other comments on that, or should I go to the next one?
That was a simple one.
Okay. We had one that's kind of actually related to that, so I thought I'd jump to it. Should the public be involved in development of the first selectman's budget? Seems like the first selectman's budget sets the tone for what the BET does later. I have some concerns that the BET chair behind the scenes is dictating to the first selectman what goes on his budget.
Well, that's a more controversial question. I'm happy to start. You know, all of people probably on this call all know that about the way a 6-to-6 divided BET works, and our hope, as I said earlier, is that the members of the BET can find a way to work together more rather than have decisions made that way. We understand that if the BET is controlled by the same party that has the first select person, that there is prioritization there. But if we had, we think of having a framework to make for what people are articulating or advocating is better. Right now, sometimes it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease, or the most determined volunteer that gets something done. And so if there's no framework, you don't, you get what we've gotten, which is sometimes just kind of stagnation. If people were working together, there will be an opportunity for the public to comment. The public should certainly comment about the next year's budget, but we equally well need public participation in what are we trying to do overall over a longer time horizon than 1 year, because 1 year inevitably, in our system at least, gets us all into, okay, does this get money or not, or that get money in this particular year, and then that's limited. That is not allowing us to prioritize thoughtfully over time, and in fact, it's probably leading to a worse outcome for the taxpayers, because I think you could make a case that while we've zealously guarded year-to-year tax increases, by kicking so much down the road, that we've exposed the town to much higher costs of projects, simply because construction costs have escalated so much that a project, if you only had a 5% a year cost escalation, and some would say that's way lower than we've had of late, something costs 25% more to build it in 5 years. If you have 7%, it costs 40% more. So you can make the case that this will probably be unpopular, but we have heard, well, I don't want to do any borrowing because that's debt for my grandchildren, and I don't want to do that. But in fact, what we've done is transferred the burden of much higher future costs to our grandchildren in order to keep taxes low for ourselves. And I think there's a balance that we have to come to there. So public involvement, we want that. We will have to figure out ways to do it. We know that we'll get some really helpful input, and we know we'll get some stuff that everybody just throws up their hands and say, what on earth can we do with that? But I think we ought to assume that we're trying to involve our citizenry.
Part of why we have recommended a more complete and maybe a little bit more disciplined ranking system is just also to get at that issue as well. And I do think that the funding of projects, right, you're really looking for that portfolio effect, which is, the town should always be conscious of thinking about, is there a market we should take advantage of? For instance, like refunding outstanding bonds or interest rates low, should we take advantage of that? But if you just think about the normal progress, right, if we had tackled some larger projects during the low interest rate environment, then in our portfolio, we would have had that lower interest rate debt. And then, now we would tackle some projects, and I wouldn't say rates are high now, but they're clearly much higher than they were a few years ago. So, you get a portfolio effect if you don't keep pushing things off, because you're just constantly handling what you need to handle along the way. So I think that sort of dovetails with what you just said, Steve. Now we're in a position where we have a lot of needs which can't be put off any further, and we're going to have to deal with it.
And I just wanted to add that one of the things that we talked about a lot was consensus building and leadership and encouraging interaction among different town leaders, because although we might not have the same way of going about it, there might be a unique goal or a goal that they can find common ground on. And so, necessarily members of the BET having conversations with the first selectman is, not necessarily a negative thing when it can be in a constructive and consensus building dialogue.
And Greenwich has done that before. We have had first select persons who were willing to create a more disciplined capital process and to try to compare projects across functions and across departments. We've also had select persons who abolished that system and didn't want to do that and kind of put it into a more private, smaller group process. We think longer term that kind of in-camera, behind closed door process is not what is best for the town of Greenwich in terms of actually understanding what its citizenry want and trying to do that within the bounds of prudence that we have.
Okay, moving on to the next question. If the study's plans are implemented, wouldn't the BET need to rethink its relationship and mandate as a governing body? Where do they stand?
Well, again, we've spent a lot of time with prior and current BET members. Far be it from any of us to tell the BET how to do anything, because it wouldn't do us any good to tell them anyway. And we ought to assume that they have good intentions. But we do think the BET could work best if the two parties could try to work together. We think it could work best if there was really thoughtful work before a chairperson made the decision. So we think it can be worked better. To change the way the BET works fundamentally would involve a charter change and structural change. We stopped short of that. That's not to say that at the end of the day, if we were all sitting here 10 years from now and we were in exactly the same position and we'd started a few projects, but now the backlog is $3 billion of would-be projects. We don't think that getting charter change is a huge amount of work, because you're basically goring everybody's ox when you do that, and you want to do it once. It'll take it would take years to do that in our committee's view. And that's why we focused on things that were stopping short of that. The way the voters have a choice, a way to express what they want, if one party is articulating a particular approach and another party is articulating a very different approach, then that ultimately, it is the control of the BET belongs to the voters, i.e. which party gets the most votes. So if you said, as if you are a voter and your view, if you wanted to accelerate the pace of capital investment, that might tell you which way you wanted to vote, which party you wanted to vote for. And sadly, the way our system works is that it's the party that gets the most votes. So if you're being, logical about it, you only vote for the candidates from the party that will do what you want to have done. I'm not sure that's what we do. And the town has a much longer term structural problem, because as we know, it's 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans, but the largest percentage of voters in our town are unaffiliated with either party. So what we're really doing is saying, if there are 40% unaffiliated voters in the town and 30% Democratic and 30% Republican, we're really saying that one of those two parties, the 30-30, gets to make the choice. That's not probably the way we all think it should be. But that again, that's charter change. The other things we could do for charter change, you could increase, let the RTM increase as opposed to only decrease budget items. That would require change. If you really take a hard look at some of our financial policies, we think those can be done without charter change, but we view charter change as the last, the tool of last resort.
And I'd just like to add, I think that if we ask each member of the BET what they thought, I think they're very independent thinkers who do their due diligence. We'd probably get 12 different answers. And I don't know if there's a crystal ball to tell us if they'd have to rethink their process. I think a lot of the suggestions, to go back to some of the things that John has said, is about best practice. So the idea of getting better data, better information, a more transparent process for the general public, and to get that in the hands of the members of the BET so they can use their skill set, they can use their talents to make evidence-based decisions. So, just my 2 cents on that.
Agreed.
I'm going to give you guys back-to-back questions on the AAA rating and debt and finance.
These guys.
So can you relate the AAA rating to the need opportunity to use longer-term financing versus 5 to 7 bonding? That's the first one. And then you've suggested there's a lot more we can do in utilizing our full financial capabilities to meet the enormous financing needs facing us without jeopardizing our AAA rating or introducing moral hazard by burdening future generations with enormous debt. Could you explain in a bit more detail the steps you think we can take going forward to meet these challenges?
John, do you want to start on that or do you want me to?
Either way, Steve. I mean, as I start, either way, Steve, and then I'll start.
Yeah.
But I mean, one thing I would just say to kick us off a little bit is about, the financial forecasting and the model we talked about. Although it seems like a small point in the overall study, it's actually very important because you need a guiding, when you're looking at sort of the technical elements of what creates a rating, if you will, right? You need a sort of a guiding instrument to do that. And we looked at a number of the models. As Steve said, there are competing models out there, and we looked at a number of the models, and some of them were flawed. I mean, they just were missing important aspects that should have been taken into consideration. So I think having the town, wherever it resides, whether it's led by the first selectman or led by the finance department, create a model, and what's changeable in that model are some key assumptions. But if the town put out a model that said, let's call it base case model, then, people can do their optimistic case, their pessimistic case, and you could look at an array of outcomes, but I think at least we'd be all working off the same tool. And so there is, I think, a starting point for answering that question is you need a tool that helps guide you, that everybody agrees is what they're going to use to work their way through the questions.
Yeah. Let me amplify a little bit. We are a AAA. That's a good thing. We have to give a lot of credit to people who have stewarded the town's finances to get us to that position. And again, as we said, we have either the lowest or the second lowest tax rate in the state, and we do have the largest grand list in the state. And those are really good things. So no one should deprecate what that has brought us. The downside, though, is that we now have, because of our funding practices, we have this huge backlog of things that need to be done. As a AAA today, we could borrow 10-year money at 2.5%. And we could borrow 20-year money at 3.3%. Those are really they're not as low as the under 2 that we could have had a couple of years ago, but they're still good, and so good borrowing rates. And we do have unused debt capacity within our AAA rating. It's in the tens of millions. I think one of the internal BET studies has this borrowing another 120 million plus over the next period of years. So we have capacity. By saying that the debt can only be 5 years or 7 years in duration, we are not tapping a very large market for longer term money. We ought to look at that more clearly. If the voters want us to accelerate the pace of construction, if the voters decide in their election that the pace is just fine, then that's all fine. The other thing I want to point out is that 3.3% or the 2.5% for 20 or 10-year money, that money, those rates are substantively lower than the cost of inflation in the projects that we have. And you can make a case that what we're really doing is guarantee by deferring and deferring and deferring, that we are guaranteeing that we're going to pay more in the future at a time when we could borrow for pretty affordable rates. So we do think, and we've talked to the town's financial advisors, and we've talked to other people at rating agencies and people who have run municipal finance departments around the country, who have basically said, gee, Greenwich is not using the tools that are available and can do that without breaking the bank. And so, because we were kind of we were not we ought to spend whatever it takes to borrow as much as we can. That was the antithesis of what we felt. But we think there is an opportunity to look through the spectrum of how we borrow and what we do it, and to work that through between the BET and the RTM, who obviously have a say on funding too.
In a odd, I know you're aware of this, Steve, but in an odd technical twist right now, because of what they call the inverted yield curve, actually borrowing for 5 years would be more expensive than borrowing for 10 years. So because short-term rates are actually higher than longer-term rates. So you actually have an odd dynamic going on right now. But I would also make the point, just as a follow-on to what Steve said, that historically, if you look at what the town's done, borrowings have gone up and down based upon the capital needs. So there has been in the past a recognition that at times we'll need to borrow more. Long-lived assets, major infrastructure projects of any type would typically be financed over a reasonable period of time, maybe not their full expected life, but a good portion of it. So a 5-year payback period is pretty much tantamount to pay as you go, quite frankly. So we are hindering ourselves by using this slightly modified pay as you go strategy, where we could really be cycling through some of the projects we need to get done more quickly without, as Steve said, jeopardizing the rating.
Yeah, we are, to amplify what John just said, we're building things that last for 50, 75, 100 years. And to say that the only way we can do it is to pay for them in 5 is really a limitation that we don't think you have to put on yourself.
And I found something I could tack on to you two smart guys here.
Yeah.
I also wanted to just mention that some of the work that we could do, either in deferred maintenance or in new capital construction, actually has the ability to reduce a burden of overhead, a burden that we're paying either in energy consumption costs, because the buildings that we're looking to manage don't have efficient exterior envelopes. They don't take advantage of renewable resources, taking us off the grid, relieving us from ties to utility payments. There's a lot of efficiencies that, we can look at this as, a burden. It is a big undertaking for our community, and it's a new climate that we're coming into, but it's also really an opportunity. If done smartly, we can really manage some capital work to help us reduce burdens that really are just outdated. At the time when it was built 50 years ago, it was current, but we're now in a climate where some of those techniques have seen really significant improvements.
One thing that we haven't talked about is what we're suggesting. This is not rocket science. This is very simple stuff. It is hard to come up with simple recommendations, but these were intentionally done to be relatively simple, to be doable, and if people are willing to talk and work together, that they could be done. And I look at from where it's a strategic vision to a financial plan to the other points that we made. If you look next door at Stamford, Connecticut, Stamford actually has a plan to do much of this. They've created a vision. They have created a financial plan. They are funding pieces of the financial plan. So we don't have to look very far to see what the tools are. I'm not saying we're going to have the commercial tax base that Stamford has, but this is going on right next door to us.
Okay, next question. It sounds like the town needs a chief financial officer. Do you agree?
No, we think that if the BET can work together and work with the first selectman and work with the RTM, we don't. But if they can't work together or choose not to, then maybe you need something more. But we did not see that if suddenly we found, I don't know, pick your name of the best municipal finance officer that any of us ever heard of. John, you probably know that person better than I would. We didn't think you needed to do that.
No, and the town does have a very good, competent financial advisor that we use for our bond issuance and other special projects. So clearly, if, for instance, we wanted to create a model and we didn't feel we had that capability internally in the town, we could, use them to create that model for us. So there's a lot of resources available without adding to our professional staff who, in our finance department is a very professional, competent staff. So they have the resources necessary.
Hi, we had a bit of a comment on discussing the accountability for elements of the process. Who should be in charge of setting project priorities? Who should be responsible for keeping the public and taxpayers informed on progress of projects underway? If you could touch on that.
Well, I think, whoever the first select person is should have a visible role in this and a leadership role, but that responsibility is shared by the other departments in the town. The Board of Ed ought to be clear on its priorities and ought to ideally keep them the same and describe what they're needed and stick to them. The BET ought to just be willing to talk about priorities openly amongst itself and with the public. The RTM ought to be willing to have its views put into that process without, in our opinion, dragging the process out for as many months as it's dragged out with the multiple duplicative presentations. We think it's a collective responsibility that ought to be done, because there are different things. The folks who might decide on how do we oversee projects aren't the same people who might do the vision. So we split this up into different areas, frankly, so that different people could assume responsibility to help implement different parts of it.
I'm a big believer in culture, and so we, from the first selectman's point of view, I mean, setting a culture and stating a culture of transparency of what we proudly do in Greenwich, and is so important. So I do think part of it is setting a tone, right, from our elected leaders, that this is what we believe in as a town. And I think we all appreciate with transparency comes commentary, criticism, complication, because you're inviting people's opinions. And I know that sometimes with all good intentions, politicians want to shy away from it because they have a job to do, which is to get through a substantial amount of work to come up with a budget, so to speak. But I think ultimately, we do need to look to our political leaders to set a culture in this town that says we make sure our citizens are fully informed, and that we, welcome all commentary, whether it's critical or supportive.
Which
And
leads us. to the
I'll
next-
add one last thing that, just on a sense of collaboration. So that, we're not hearing conflicting sources, conflicting information, conflicting data. So something to the effect of, just to build on what John was saying, that sense of collaboration and responsibility across, across our BET, across our departments, across our first selectmen and our RTM and members of our community, because we have so many of them that really are so invested and serve in many, many different capacities. We have over 100 must be. I don't even know how many volunteers in this town from all different all different steps and all different walks of life. So I know we have a very invested community.
Okay, moving to the next question. I live here because of the town's long history of low taxes and high quality of life. How does this plan maintain these two fundamental characteristics we pride ourselves in? In other words, this seems like a classic tax and spend policy. Increase our taxes and increase our spending.
If you want to put a political spin on it, you can say we should not do anything, but we think the citizenry as a whole, these issues matter to every citizen in the town. The quality of our public facilities is reflected in our real estate values and reflected in the quality of life we have. It's also reflected in the quality of life those of us who live here for a long time give to our children. I think it is an incomplete comparison to say that the low taxes are the only good thing about our town. And the concern that we have about some of the things that have been done over the last 20 years or longer, really, are that what we've done is we've kept taxes low on a year-to-year basis, but we haven't funded our needs. So we are now to a position where, well, if you looked at the schools, just only the schools, and again, this is about way more than the schools, the private schools outshine the public schools dramatically in terms of quality. They put tens of millions of dollars into those schools where we have not yet been able to start. That can't be good for our real estate values as a town long term. And again, if you think about, we think this plan can be of accelerating expenditures can be done. I mean, let's suppose you borrowed $100 million at 3.3%. Okay, that's $3.3 million of service a year. You're talking about, that's against a tax base that's $375 million. So it's really not major. And yes, I know you've got to do a longer evaluation and talk about paying back the debt and all of that kind of stuff, but we have unnecessarily handicapped ourselves. And I'm not worried that the town will, if you will, go back to being bankrupt, because that's not the way people think, and it doesn't have to happen. But just opening up our tool chest will allow, we believe as a committee, will allow us to do things that the voters would like. Ultimately, this is a voter choice. The voters are going to pick a select person, and they're going to pick a BET. And this is ultimately a voter choice, again, this November, for saying, do we want, ideally both parties agree with this. I I know you would say I live in fairyland if I believe that the two parties will agree on this, but they should, because it really is common sense stuff.
7 o'clock, and we had many more questions that we did not get to. Our plan is to get those questions and the answers to those questions on our website. We will have a recording of this event that we plan to share. I want to thank everybody who participated in the panelists. Thank you so much for your time. Board members, thank you, Abigail and Christina. We hope the audience has found it informative. We will be posting the video on our website and sharing it with the broader community. There will be several follow-up sessions to this presentation in the next 6 weeks. We are scheduling 2 smaller group discussion Zoom sessions for between 6 and 20 participants on August the 2nd and on August the 8th at different times. We won't run it if we don't get 6, and we'll go to a waiting list if we get more than 20. Then on September 13th, we will be having an in-person presentation and discussion in the Black Box Theater at the Greenwich Library beginning at 7 p.m. We expect this issue will require additional attention in the months to come, and we plan to focus on it. One may register for the sessions on the website homepage, www.lwvgreenwich.org. And I just want to say from Maine, which is where we are, thank you for attending. Enjoy what remains of the all too quickly fleeting summer and thunderstorms and whatever, which I know are in Greenwich tonight. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, Sandy, I'd like to just conclude by thanking not only Kate and John, but really the whole committee, because these people worked for 15 months. Nobody got paid a nickel. Many of them had day jobs, but they talked to an enormous amount of people and came to the effort to come to what we hope are conclusions of things that we could actually do in the town to make it better.
Great. I agree. Thank you to everybody, and good night.
Good night.